I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guest today is Damon Linker, who teaches political science at the University of Pennsylvania, also has a newsletter called Notes from the Middle Ground on Substack. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Rob. Great to be here.
All right. So the reason I asked you to be on is that you wrote something actually like a late spring. You wrote something that caught my eye, and I've been meaning to talk to you about this. And I think as we get back into the school year, it seems appropriate, which is you wrote something about teaching political theory and American politics to students and sort of this experience of doing that while being smack dab in the middle of a lot of very strange and unusual political practice.
Yeah, absolutely. What happened is that last spring semester, I was originally rostered in the Penn Political Science Department to teach a couple of courses, one of which was going to be a seminar on like reactionary ideas, and it was a little bit under enrolled. It probably would have flown, but it was kind of close enough to the margin that if a few people dropped at the last minute, it might get canceled. So I was thinking to myself, what should I teach instead? And right around that time, we had the election, and Trump not only won, but he won the popular vote for the first time. And so I thought to myself, how about I teach basically Trump 2.0?
Well, the funny thing is that is essentially a de facto seminar on reactionary ideas.
That is true, although that was going to be more like political theory,
Right,
like
right, yeah.
reading like pretty abstruse texts and things, which I do think would have been pretty germane to what's going on. But I was thinking in terms of like something that would really kind of grab very practically minded Penn students. You know, we're Ben Franklin's university here, and that means very much in terms of like the practical side of things. So. I launched this alternative course and it filled up immediately. And what it ended up being was, and of course, our first day of class was a couple weeks before the inauguration, so nothing had really happened yet. And my idea was that I would ask the students to pick one executive branch department or agency as their beat. And for the semester, they would sort of monitor what was going on there and report back to the class every week when we met what was happening with the Trump administration. And then they would turn that into a research project on the history and possible future of that department or agency. And so the class, you know, we start the class, then there's the inauguration, and everything goes haywire with Trump basically, let's be honest, fulfilling all of his campaign promises.
Yes.
Everything he said he would do, he is doing. And like more than I actually thought he was. And so suddenly I have all these students who are like looking at the State Department, the Defense Department, Homeland Security, ISIS, all of these things and reporting back in these alarming ways about stuff that's going on. And then I ended up, my sort of beat was going to be kind of anything they hadn't picked, as well as various court decisions that were coming down basically like every day.
Yeah.
And so what I ended up doing is just subscribing to Jack Goldsmith's Substack because he and Bob Bauer, sort of, especially last spring, were like every couple of days they'd have a new substantive post where they would review the court decisions. And so I would sort of report back to the class on the status of all of these things. And it was a remarkable experience and a truly unnerving one because it was very much as if we were kind of taking notes on the not so slow motion assault on and crumbling of liberal democratic self-government in the United States, kind of in real time. And there were a number of classes. I remember a number of them having to do with picking up picking up people, accusing them of being here illegally, and then deporting them to Venezuela without any due process. Those classes around that in February when that was happening, and then the stuff around the imposition of the tariffs in early April, and where I had to sort of not only explain the law around that and what Trump was doing, but also try to teach the kids a little bit about the bond market, which at that moment was like we had bond yields surging and like how that's
Yeah.
connected to
Well,
the stock market and like what that means for our debt burden.
and the whole concept, by the way, of, we talk about the checks and balances in our system of government, the idea of the bond market and the stock market as in effect a de facto part of the checks and balances.
Right, exactly. And in fact, because Trump is a businessman and does care about what happens with the markets, that was far more effective of a check on him than most of what the other branches were doing because, he doesn't want to be president while the stock market utterly collapses. And so that actually scared him a little bit to back off of the most draconian, insane things he was doing with tariffs. But then what he, I think, has learned is that if he backs off and then imposes it again a little while later, selectively here and there, and then announces a few deals with different countries that like even the markets sort of become accustomed to the craziness. And
Spoils
so
the frog.
now they don't really do much when there's another tariff announcement. And so that check has sort of waned along with so many of the other checks, such that he can still, be messing around with tariffs and the markets don't really react very much. So that too has sort of faded as an effective check on the man.
So the fading of effective checks, I mean, that really, I think, to me, that is the big story. It's not that Trump is trying to do all this stuff, because I knew, you knew, and I knew, people who follow this closely, we knew that Trump was promising to do all this stuff. And the reason we weren't absolutely panicking on January 19th, that this was going to happen tomorrow. The reason is we thought, well, he'll try to do all this stuff, but it'll get bogged down. There'll be people who resist. There'll be people who say no. There'll be court cases that go against him. We thought, I thought this way. Most people I know thought this way, that he's going to try to do a lot of stuff. There will be effective checks. He will not, and this is sort of going off of what happened in his first term, right? That he has all these bad instincts, but they got bogged down and people checked it and people didn't follow through. So
Right.
I guess the big question is why hasn't that been happening?
That's a great question, and I think about it a lot. I mean, the fact is that a lot of my writing through last fall, as we headed toward the election, was on this exact topic, arguing that the reason no one should vote for this man is precisely because it would be much worse this time.
Mhm.
That he would not be surrounded by normie Republicans or generally Reaganite insensibility and who would like slow walk absurd orders and sort of try to gum up the works a little bit so he couldn't singularly smash through everything in our system. And there were all kinds of signs that that wouldn't work this time because of lots of changes that have happened. I mean, the fact that he did January 6th and immediately after that, a lot of mainstream Republicans denounced it. And then he didn't go away. He stuck around. His polling remained pretty solid. And then once the indictments from various directions came toward him, each one seemed to like actually help him with Republican voters. And then we had DeSantis as someone who I would never vote for in a million years because he was like Trump light or Trump with a
Yeah.
brain, Trump with competence. But even that, I maintained all along that as bad as I thought DeSantis was, he would still be preferable to Trump. If we have to settle for DeSantis, that's bad because it would signal that the Republican Party had shifted in a right populist direction a lot. But at least he's not like kind of insane and a megalomaniac and seemingly personalizing everything with his enemies and using the power of the government to punish them, which is what we're living through at the moment, incidentally, with the free
Yeah, yeah,
speech attacks. But anyway, I sort of saw all this happening, and then DeSantis runs and he peters out, and Trump walks to the nomination with no resistance whatsoever. I think a lot of elected Republicans simply looked at this and just thought, my God, this is it. There is no other Republican Party but this guy. And
yep,
if he manages somehow to win a second time, then there's no way we can stand against him because he's shown that he can weaponize our own voters against us. Mitt Romney, in the very good McKay Coppins book on Romney, you see Romney talking about the danger that office holders feel for their safety. They're not all multimillionaires like Mitt Romney who can afford private security to protect themselves and their families. And so all of this sort of played into a fear of mine that if he actually manages to do this again, then he's going to be unbound in a new
yeah,
way. And then the fact that when he won, he didn't just squeak through again with another inside straight of losing the popular vote and yet just somehow managing to win just enough of the Electoral College. He actually added to his coalition in all kinds of ways, and he actually won the popular vote this time. And you put that in on top of everything else I've already said, I think the Republican Party just concluded he's the guy.
yeah. This is the
We have no public opinion on our own side to stand on to resist him.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. A good example is what happened here, where I am down in Central Virginia, the fifth district, which is around Charlottesville and Lynchburg, that area. That in the last redistricting, what happened is that the incumbent congressman who was super conservative, a very MAGA, a guy named Bob Good, the incumbent congressman for the fifth district was put in the same district as a rising sort of ambitious guy named John McGuire. And what happened is Bob Good had made the mistake of it. I think he had endorsed DeSantis early on. And that was the fatal mistake. That was it. And Trump endorsed McGuire and not Good. And then Good lost to the primaries. So it's like you be a MAGA, you can be a MAGA Republican, you can be staunchly along the lines and everything, but if Trump does not approve of you, you will lose your primary and you're out. And
Yeah.
that's the sort of thing that convinced them. And Trump has this, Trump is a master gaslighter, right? He's a guy whose his whole career really is not in the real estate industry, it's in the media industry. And he's very good at the idea you just repeat something over and over and over again. So, what I noticed is the minute the next day after the election, he said, "I have a massive mandate." And he won he got a plurality of the popular vote, but he didn't even break 50%. He was just a little shy. But he's acting as if he got 56% or 58%.
Right.
And just repeats that. He's learned that you repeat it over and over again, and some people will just buy it, including your
Yeah,
opponents.
and I think it's extremely significant, and that actually is one reason. I mean, this maybe maybe you won't agree with this, but this is kind of how I analyze this stuff. That one of the reasons why the situation we're in is not just it's really bad that a guy who believes what Trump believes is president, but we're actually seem to be like careening towards some kind of authoritarian dictatorship here is the fact that, think back to and a lot of people on the Trump right like to say, oh, this is just basically FDR from the right. He's just doing what FDR did, but in the opposite ideological direction. And there is some truth to looking at it that way, except for one crucially important point. FDR won overwhelmingly in the popular vote, and He and his party controlled Congress with veto-proof supermajorities, and in the midterm elections of 1934 and then re-election in 1936, they increased their margins such that the Democrats controlled upwards of 70 Senate seats. So do I like to imagine a world in which Donald Trump commanded that popularity? No, I do not. However, we might not be in quite such a dangerous situation if we weren't in the situation where a guy who's trying to act and govern as an authoritarian, combined with the fact that literally half the country, and now if you believe the aggregate opinion polling, that actually more like 55% of the country strongly disagrees with him. You have a guy trying to do this in a country where he's actually slightly outnumbered by people who hate what he's doing. So you had this grinding of the gears of him trying to govern sort of like an FDR who sweeps up, tries to make sweeping change to our whole constitutional conception of government, vastly increase the powers of the executive, both within the executive branch and vis-a-vis the other branches, combined with the fact that he doesn't have anything like a mandate to do that. It's just incredibly corrosive and dangerous because it provokes a kind of left reaction, which he then uses as a kind of pretext to grab even more power. And we end up in this cycle that we've been in on and off, up and down for the last 10 years.
Well, I also think that the real danger, as I see it, is that yeah, the fact that the idea that he's an FDR but from the right is to my viewpoint is an argument against him, right? Because FDR really did massively expand the power of government. He really did abuse executive power. I think part of where we are with this sort of imperial presidency that we've had for the last, it's been growing over the last 100 years. But one of the people who really grew the imperial presidency and gave the presidency a lot of extra powers was FDR, and some of the things that he's trying to overturn Humphrey's executive, which is this 1935 Supreme Court decision that limited the president's ability to replace and to basically hold under his thumb the heads of various agencies. And this was like, these were the things that were put into place to try to stop FDR and limit FDR from what the even greater power he wanted to exert. So, but I do think the real danger is that FDR had the advantage of sort of strategic patience, I think would be the way to put it. That because he has such a big majority behind him, he could try to do something, get stopped, and say, "Well, I'll wait. I'll keep, I'll get Congress behind me. I'll get, he could do more later." Whereas I think Trump has Trump's people are very much acting like this. That they have this idea that, look, we have basically this year. We have this year to clamp down and get so much total control because they know they're going to get killed. They're going to get, I shouldn't say killed in this current context, but they know they're going to get voted out in the midterms. They know they've got a tiny little majority in Congress. They've done so many unpopular things. They are almost, I think it's like a 99% certainty they are going to lose a lot of seats in the next midterm election. And so I get the feeling it's like they know that. And they are working to basically make the next midterm election irrelevant by imposing so much power that they can't be dislodged.
Yeah, I think that is one plausible scenario for what's coming and what's motivating what's happening in the present. When it comes to prognosticating about the midterms, I'm extremely worried. Like I think that first of all, we have all of these redistricting pushes that that the Republicans are trying to go for. I understand totally the way, at least since 1992, we've been in this reality where typically the first midterm election in a new president's administration leads to a kind of thermostatic swing against the incumbent party. And it is also true that the margin is so narrow in the House that one would definitely expect them to lose control. That is the most likely scenario. But you combine the redistricting push that's going to try to actually pad that
Yeah.
margin, combined with the fact that Trump has made moves to try to nationalize election control in a way that is not the American tradition. The federal government usually doesn't really have much oversight
Well, not
of
only
local
is it not
issues.
the American tradition, it's also not. I mean, the president has no power in the Constitution. Power over elections is given to the states, with
Right.
the Congress having a role of
Right, but of course the Congress is his puppet.
yeah,
They're the marionette. And so how much do they make a mess in various places? Now it's hard to do because the fact that it's so decentralized means like trying to mess with it means you need a giant like 10-foot large map with like every congressional district and precinct mapped out and figuring out where is it kind of close in a red state where there's a blue district that's actually pretty close, and we might be able to futz with the margins a little bit so that a Republican might win in that district.
yeah,
That's hard stuff to try to manipulate from the top, but I don't put it past them to try. And then there's the fact that even if the Democrats take control of the House, maybe in the end Trump will love that more than anything because now he has an enemy to fight that he can use to kind of whip up his own side even more. And then you also saw this week, I saw a story saying that they're actually going to try to hold a convention next
yeah.
summer to nationalize the midterms and make it more like a presidential election, which is for them, I will say, very smart. The reason why Democrats in general tend to do better in these off-year elections lately is because the electoral coalitions have shifted such that the most informed and educated voters are now Democrats. They show up even if there's this weird, off schedule election because someone died or left office, and Republicans don't show up because they're now the less educated and less engaged voters. But if Trump can make it seem as if this is like a presidential election and it's like you're voting for me if you
Yeah.
show up, that could elevate the Republican turnout next November such that the result isn't exactly what we expect.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm Damon Downer. That's kind of my followers on Substack, my regular commenters sort of refer to me that way because I'm always like, oh, but have you considered the gloomy side of things? And that is what kind of keeps me up at night is this fear that they are playing a kind of rugby scrum here that is nasty and is constantly flirting with illegality and cheating, outright cheating, and then just messing with the system, such that I'm not sure how one wins against it unless you're cheating back. And I
Well,
also don't want my own side to cheat because then we've forfeited the reason why it's better to vote for us than the other guy. So we're sort of trapped in this nightmare.
well, I kind of like the idea of doing retaliatory redistricting, but with like I think even in the if I'm correct in the California version of it, they actually have this only goes into effect if Texas redistricts. So it's
Yeah,
like
I mean,
you make it totally conditional on that it goes into place and goes out of place, entirely dependent on what the other party's doing.
that's fine, and I am sad to admit that this might be the only thing we can do at this point, given the hardball tactics from the right and the enormous stakes. But each round of these escalations
Yeah.
just move us more away from a kind of stable Republican self-government, a small
Right.
r Republican self-government, because then you end up with the Republicans in California, and they're really outnumbered by Democrats, but there's still millions of them. And if they feel like they have no representation because they've zeroed out the electoral map such that anywhere they live, they end up they end up being outvoted by Democrats because of the way they drew the lines, then that makes those voters less wedded to a system in which you, as Aristotle says, that you rule and are ruled in turn. You
Hmm.
hand off, you accept an electoral loss because you know you can come back the next time and have a fair chance. If we make it so that in blue states, Republicans can't get representation, and in red states, Democrats can't get representation, we've moved another step toward a kind of weird civil war scenario where there are no real lines where you could have an actual civil war, but what you end up with is people being driven out of politics into things like terrorism and violence, like we saw with the Kirk assassination and so forth.
Yeah, though I don't think that's necessarily driven by. I mean, people say, oh, the Kirk assassination example of political violence. These things, the political violence we've had so far has generally been fairly idiosyncratic. I mean,
That's true.
it
These are
is some
lone
one
world,
guy with his
lone
own
wolf
weird
guys.
context and spending too much time online, or voices talking to him in his head, or whatever.
That's
Um,
true. Although, when we're talking about, Trump almost getting his head blown open, it's true that that guy was kind of acting alone and he's just a lunatic. But then again, lunatics can just ask the start of World War One and
yeah,
Franz Ferdinand. There are those guys can actually make a big difference in how history unfolds. And so if there are more of them around, whatever the cause, I certainly don't buy the right's
yeah,
bullshit line of the last week and a half of
yeah.
like there's some organized thing on the left that produces assassins by teaching them that Republicans are evil and should die. Like that's utter nonsense. And these are just lunatics. I mean, our country produces more than its share on the aggregate. Like we
Where
produce
I've
a lot of these people, and
yeah.
some of them are politicized from the right, and some are politicized from the left, and they're insane, and
Well,
that's
where I
unfortunate.
was going with this, though, is I think in some ways I'm more of a downer than you are in terms of I'm more alarmed in the short term for two reasons. One is I think the fact that we actually haven't had a lot of people who you could really say, man, like the guy who shot Franz Ferdinand was like part of an actual organized revolutionary organization that did this assassination for very overt political reasons. We haven't had that kind of conspiracy kind of political violence, but we can have it, and that's where I was going with this. Is that we should actually be realize that it can get a lot, if things get out of control, it can get a lot worse than what we have right now.
Oh, sure. And the rhetoric we've seen from the right over the last 10
Oh yeah.
days is extremely worrying for that
Well,
because it's portray I mean, they got control of everything. They control the presidency, both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, a majority of state legislatures and state houses and governorships. They are running the show. They're having influences on civil society that are more alarming than anything I've ever seen in my lifetime in law firms and universities and media companies. And yet, they also feel that they live in a reality in which the left wants to destroy them, kill them, will shoot them, shoot a bullet through their jugular vein in a crowd, and then they'll cheer it. And this kind combination of them being incredibly powerful, not restrained by the normal constraints of liberal democratic procedures, and then a kind of paranoid kind of fear of violent attack is a very, very volatile mixture and could go sideways in all kinds of ways, including the ways we've seen over the last week with crackdowns on freedom of speech. And then also, as you're alluding to, kind of re-jump starting the kind of militia movement with, fueled by nitroglycerin. It's
yeah, yeah.
really, really dangerous.
Well, so that's what I wanted to get to, which is especially with this thing of the chairman of the FCC coming out and basically threatening, and not basically threatening, actually threatening, directly threatening TV stations in order to get a comedian's show removed because he said something insufficiently respectful of Charlie Kirk. And also the president just came out, I think on Air Force One, I think it was last night or the night before, saying something about how, they have these TV shows that all they ever do is criticize me, and they have licenses. They're not allowed to do that, which is the, complete declaration of political censorship as the new normal. So, well, something you wrote in the spring was that, you thought we were headed towards sort of a Hungarian style competitive authoritarianism, and you said it was going much more quickly. I'm wondering if we're going towards competitive authoritarianism, but without the competition.
Yeah, and if that's true, then yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I was alluding to and talking about. Like, I don't want to predict what happens in the midterms. I mean, what I didn't say explicitly is like, do we even know we're going to have midterm elections? I mean, at this point, I mean, we're like 14 months from the midterm elections, 13, 14 months. It's only been like 8, 9 months since the guy became president, and look where we are. How is the country going to look a year from now as we're heading toward those elections? You know, are there going to be National Guard troops stationed outside polling places who have been trained by, whatever, watching Charlie Kirk videos or whatever the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War was
Yeah.
suggesting the other day? I can't even begin to imagine. So, yes, it's possible my worst case scenario all the way back to before the last election, and I wrote about this in some of my posts on my Substack and also in an essay. I wrote a long essay in October for Persuasion, where I tried to kind
Mhm.
of conjure the future and imagine what a second Trump administration would look like. And again, I think I very much undershot how bad it would be. You go back and read what I was saying about like Schedule F and firing civil servants. Like Trump has gone like 5 times beyond what I thought he might do in that respect. But when it came to like worst case scenarios that end in authoritarianism, it has always been that we end up in a kind of escalatory cycle where the left goes violent in protesting of Trump in response to perfectly understandable provocations by Trump that like I would understand why people would get outraged and go protest. But some of them get violent. He calls up troops. The troops get embroiled in violence with protesters. Someone gets shot. A bunch of people get shot. And Trump ends up invoking the Insurrection Act.
Right.
The Insurrection Act is the worst case scenario, shiny thing flying out there in the breeze that we have not come close to yet. But there are all kinds of scenarios where he thinks he has sufficient support from Republicans and public opinion on his own side to make that move. The Insurrection Act is the most dangerous thing on the books in the federal code, in my opinion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
It is a gigantic open-ended prescription for the imposition of authoritarian dictatorship if used in the way that I think Trump would use it, and if Congress refuses to defy it. There's
I
simply
also think
no.
the greatest, if you want to talk about the greatest failure of the Biden years, was there were
Yes.
people saying we have to get rid of this law. This law could be used to do anything, and they failed to act on it.
That's entirely true. I did give at the time the Biden people and the Democrats in Congress, I gave them a lot of credit for doing some other things, but as usual, this is always the case. It's always you're solving the last problem. So
Yeah.
they did make some changes to the certification process of electoral votes in Congress so that we couldn't do another January 6th, basically taking the vice president out of the process so
Yeah.
that instead of Pence, now we have Vance. Like if there were another election where the president refused to accept the outcome, this whole scenario hatched by John Eastman the last time that like Pence could refuse to sign off, and therefore we could be in this weird suspension period where you could kind of demand recounts and revotes of electors at the state level and end up with it being rejiggered so that Trump would actually win in the Electoral College. They did change things, so that is much more difficult and great. But the bigger danger is that there is this provision in the federal code that allows the president to declare an emergency and under the Insurrection Act and give him essentially dictatorial powers. And this is equivalent to the provision in the Weimar Constitution that allowed Hitler to seize dictatorial power in the wake of the Reichstag fire.
Right.
And they did pass the Enabling Act, but really what the Enabling Act did was just say, we're now living under that provision of the Weimar Constitution, which allows emergency rule. So the weird thing, people who like make analogies to Hitler like don't often note that they never got rid of the Weimar Constitution. They were technically still living under it the entire time Hitler was in power, because all he did was press the emergency button that was in that constitution, and voila, we get Nuremberg laws and the concentration camp system and the tentacles of dictatorship spreading throughout civil society in Germany. And the result is the bloodiest, most evil, heinous tyranny in human history under the Weimar Constitution. And so the thing that I really worry about is somehow, I mean, you don't even have to say somehow, because we can already see how it will happen, is that he keeps probing, pushing, taking liberties, provoking the left over and over again, and not just the left, but any law-abiding American who cares about the Bill of Rights and our system of checks and balances, and it leads to greater chaos, violence that gives him the perfect pretext. The shooting of Charlie Kirk wasn't enough for that. It's a dialectical thing.
But if they go as far as they have with this, what happens if something else happens?
Exactly. Like, what if some other prominent politician is assassinated or nearly assassinated, or just riots and bloodshed, like a replay of 2020, but in this context with some of the rioting and looting in cities. And then he sends in the National Guard in these places where they're not wanted. And instead of it being a nothing burger, like it sort of has been in California and DC, it becomes violent. And then he says, I'm invoking the Insurrection Act, which other presidents have done. But of course, they were responsible statesmen, and they did it for a very brief period of time, and then they got rid of it because George H.W. Bush during the LA riots, he invoked the Insurrection Act for a few days to tamp down the violence, and then it was lifted because that's what a responsible president does. But as with everything else that Trump has done within our system to show its weaknesses, he's revealed that an awful lot that we took for granted for good government in this country was the result not of laws, not of codified rules, but instead just assuming responsible public servants who wouldn't seize the powers that are there if you try to take them. And we are now in a reality where the president of the United States doesn't give a shit. He will do anything he wants.
Yeah, I think in the past, I mean, I've covered I've followed and covered other presidents, and they've done things that are beyond their legitimate powers, but they've nibbled at the edges cautiously when doing that. I'm going to forgive a certain number of student loans by executive order, and it turns out, well, no, you don't. There are a couple that you could do. You actually have the power to do it. Most of the ones you're trying to do, you don't actually have the power to do this. But it was real small ball nibbling around the edges kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I know the right loves to say Biden defied the Supreme Court and continuing to issue, these, waive the repayment of student loans. But that's not actually true. He abided by what the court said. He then continued to use loopholes in the law as it exists to like find different tranches of borrowers who he could legally still forgive loans.
Yeah.
Now, you could say that like that was violating the spirit of what the court said, but as a legal matter, it was not Biden saying, "Oh, the Supreme Court said I can't do it. I'm going to do it anyway." It was not that straightforward or cut and dried. And the honest truth is Trump hasn't done a lot exactly like that. When the court has said he can't do something and it's the Supreme Court, he so far has said fine, but that's also because the court hasn't said that he can't do very much.
Well, that's the one thing I wanted to go into, which is that, when you're writing about this early in the year, and I think a lot of us had the same outlook, is that, we thought the big showdown was going to be Trump versus the courts. And I think, and I think you actually said something earlier about earlier in the year about how, that the real thing to look for is, when the courts rule against Trump, what happens? And I don't think we anticipated the full extent to which the I call it the Calvin Ball court we have now, where they will the 6 vote conservative majority, for all their talk about originalism, they will go and they will find this sort of Calvin Ball crazy set of rules to basically be able to rule in favor of presidential power so long as Donald Trump's in office.
Well, my view of this is a little different than some people on our side of this, so I'm happy to explain that because
Yeah, go ahead.
I do think I have like a somewhat unique take on it. I think what you said, describing it as Calvin Ball and kind of like post hoc rationalization of whatever Trump wants to do, I would apply that to Thomas and Alito. I think they're just in the bag for Trump and just want to let him do what he wants. The others, I have much more mixed views. I think Barrett and Roberts are at the kind of other end of a spectrum, and then we have Kavanaugh and Gorsuch kind of in the middle. And I have actually a lot more empathy for their situation. The fact is that the courts do not have an enforcement mechanism. They more than the other branches because they have no political base of any kind. They are sort of they have not a lot of choice but to sort of make prudential judgments about like what it's possible for them to do in given situations. And I think, for instance, to give you an example, because it's coming down the pike, I think sooner rather than later, the whole tariff case.
Yes.
I think if you look at the letter of the Constitution, there is no question that what Trump has done is unconstitutional. Like he should not have the power to impose and lift and mess around with tariffs and trade in the way he's done. However, for the last like 80 years, Congress has repeatedly sort of said, let the president handle the trade stuff. And the current Congress has repeatedly voted to say, let Trump handle the trade stuff.
Yeah.
In such a situation, I don't think they can come out and say, this is unconstitutional, you can't do this. Because the system, if we remember the line from Federalist 51 about ambition counteracting ambition, the system is built such that if the president usurps congressional power, the first line of defense is Congress needs to stand up and say, you can't do that. And then the president says, yes, I can. And then the courts come in and say, Congress is right, you can't do that. And then the Congress and the courts together say to the other branch, get back in your corner.
Yeah.
If we're in a situation where Trump says, I'm going to do it, and usurp congressional powers in the Constitution, and Congress says, good, the court doesn't have any leverage to defend itself and enforce a ruling that says, Actually, Congress is wrong. You should be standing up for yourself against this guy. If Congress then, if they ruled that way and Congress took the president's side against the court, what would that do to the court as an institution? It would reveal that it is utterly toothless.
Well,
And,
on the other
and
hand, though, my problem with that sort of institutionalist reasoning that I know Roberts is very deeply invested in is that you end up losing power anyway, right? Because you just give way and give way and give way before the presidency. So you make the court irrelevant. So why not at least attempt to assert the court's power? And even if it ends up being a failure, at least you tried as opposed to just letting it wash away.
I mean, maybe they'll make that calculation. I'm skeptical that they will. And again, I do have some sympathy for why. I don't think the system is supposed to rule in I mean, what we're taught, this is a fight over supremacy across the three branches. And it is perfectly legitimate, and the system is supposed to work such that president tries to usurp Congress. Congress says no. They can't decide who's right. The courts step in and choose a side, and then those two fight against the other. They are not set up for the court to unilaterally say, we alone are supreme over the elected branches and are going to tell them they're wrong and they can't do it. And if they tried to do it, I think the result could be even worse than allowing Trump to actually have the powers he's claiming, because then we realize, oh, the court actually has no powers whatsoever.
Well, so one of the things that strikes me about this, though, is that there's all discussion about how things are set up and the way things are supposed to work. And what I see, and this is what intrigued me about your original post about teaching this, is that what we're really seeing right now is the clash between theory and practice. That there's a theory of how the American government is supposed to work, and which largely coheres with how it has worked up until, a year ago. And then there's the practice, which is radically different from how it's supposed to work in theory.
Right. It is not working as designed. And it goes back longer than the last year. I mean, when was the last time we amended the Constitution? I mean, what has it been, half a century?
In the 70s sometime, yeah.
Why? We had all these amendments up till then. We banned alcohol, and then we banned the ban on alcohol within like a decade. Like, because we're so divided that no issue has sufficient overwhelming consensus that you can do it. Similarly with impeachment. We keep impeaching presidents, but we can't convict them. So do we even have a provision for impeaching presidents? It doesn't seem to function because you need overwhelming majorities to do these things. And then we have these other issues of like the presidency usurping the powers of Congress, and Congress saying, thank you for taking my prerogatives, Mr. President, because now I can just enjoy the perks of being an office holder in the imperial capital, and you can actually do the hard work of governing, and I can avoid blame.
I can post on social media, and that's my
and
job.
go on Fox News and make money and have affairs with pages and do all of this behind the scenes and enjoy this so much that when I'm 89 years old, I still won't retire because it's the best job in the goddamn world. And meanwhile, Trump just runs the country. And we made a few Weimar comparisons or analogies so far. I mean, I don't want to go too much in the Rome direction, but like this is how republics die. It is. It's the Senate, and in Rome, the Senate didn't disappear. There was still a Senate. It just had no real powers, and the senators were just fat and corrupt and having orgies in the Capitol and having fun. And they had sinecures, and if someone made a speech that pissed off the emperor, they brought him in and fattened him up and gave him a bribe, and then they went back and they shut up.
Yeah.
And so like I think we are far closer to that today than we were a couple of years ago. And a couple of years ago, we were closer to it than we were a decade ago. And as you go back in time, you can see the system degrading in this way that is very analogous to when it's happened in the past.
All right. So the last thing I want to end on though is that you were teaching this to young people
Yeah.
at the university. And I guess the question is, my big concern is something you raised, which is these are people who haven't known anything else, right? They came of age with Trump in office the first time. That whole style of politics, that whole approach to politics is their native, the thing that they've. My concern is is that not something they would regard simply as normal. So, what is your experience on that in terms of how are the kids reacting?
Yeah, they're pretty cagey. Like they don't, I mean, I don't know. I always aspire in my teaching, or I always have, like when I teach a political theory course, which is usually what I teach, like what I described in the Trump 2.0 course was more of a public policy course than a political theory course. But usually I'm a classical liberal in the sense that like I'm not teaching a course in linker. I'm teaching a course in whatever I'm teaching that day and whatever they read. And if I'm teaching Plato, I become Plato. And if I'm teaching Locke, I'm Locke. If I'm Nietzsche, I'm Nietzsche. And I want them to understand the ideas and then figure it out for themselves. They have to decide who they think is right. And I want them to have all the tools necessary to make those judgments. So this class, though, tested that. I mean, it was very clear that I thought what was happening was terrible. And I did not restrain myself from saying that. Now, I would definitely entertain various different ways of construing it. To make sense of how bad it was and what analogies were fitting and which were not. And where all of them came down, I don't think I had any pro-Trump students, but it's possible that a few of them actually sort of liked some of this and just they remained quiet, felt like they were outnumbered. But in general, my sense of the students, I'm also teaching a course on conservatism in theory and practice right now,
Yeah.
a seminar for first years. And and I actually in the first day of that class I take a kind of anonymous poll, hand out a piece of
Yeah.
paper where they don't put anything down except where they situate themselves politically. And it was actually a beautiful spectrum. I had like three or four liberal progressives. I had like two or three self-described conservatives, and then a bunch sort of in the moderate middle. So I have a good arrangement there. And the thing that they share, having grown up in this era, is that they think it's bad. Um, and yet there's like no alternative in view. They know nothing else, as you said.
Yeah.
And that includes like the assassination of Kirk, which they thought was bad, but yet they had a kind of more what you'd expect from hearing about how much embroiled in social media the youngins are these days, like almost like it was a shooter game that had gone in an unexpected direction. Like it's not real, but it is. But like the world is a shooter game. Like the two Democratic representatives in Minnesota who were murdered over the summer. Trump gets his ear nicked with a bullet whizzing past his head last summer. And then like mass shootings, school shootings, like happen all the time. Every few months, there's a huge mass shooting in this country. They sort of look out at the world and they're like, we live in a world where like murderous violence can erupt anytime, anywhere, in any direction. And that's the world. And our politics is somehow like apt for a world like that. Just kind of insane violence, insults flying in every direction, the president asserting dictatorial powers to try to impose order on the chaos. And that's how they view the world. Like compare that to you and I. Like I grew up, I was 10 in 1980. So like the first politician who really made an impression on me was 8 years of Ronald Reagan, then
Yeah.
4 years of Bush, and then moderate sort of center left Clinton, followed by Bush. And then like in 9/11, things went sideways for the first time. Like that was the first event in my life where it felt like, whoa, the world's coming apart in a way. And since then, things have been, I think, in a downward spiral in a lot of ways. I do think things started going wrong with 9/11, with the country sort of going crazy. And a lot of, I think a lot of voters, especially on the right, sort of never recovered from that shattering of illusions in a lot of ways. But there are many ways to tell that story. But anyway, that's how it I think it looks. I mean, think of these kids. I mean, as you said, like in there, and like they were like 9 years old when Trump first won. And so they've had Trump January 6th, Biden, and now Trump again. Like that's their reality. And and uh and they know nothing else. Like Obama is like a story they've heard stories about. 9/11 was like the Kennedy assassination for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, a really like exciting story, but like I have nothing to add because I wasn't around. So it's just it's disturbing. And I don't that's why like the longer term trajectory of this, I couldn't even begin to
Yeah.
surmise
Yeah.
because
Well,
and
so
then there's the fact that last one sentence is there's the never forget this is happening everywhere. It might be crazier here because Americans are a little crazy. No one has a Donald Trump, but France, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Poland, France, UK, Reform Party is in the lead
yeah.
in
And
Great
and
Britain.
and the Labor Party is in retreat or is
The
in
Labour
appeasement
Party's
mode.
in retreat, and in some polls, the Tories are in third place. Like we've gone through the looking glass, my friend.
Yeah.
Where this goes, what politics looks like. I kind of have a dark feeling that like I'm going to have my grandkids on my knees telling them stories about what politics was like in the 80s and 90s, and they'll like think I'm crazy. Like, what? No. George H.W. Bush left that nice note for Clinton in the Resolute desk. Really? Wow. I mean, you've seen that thing where like
Yeah,
you've
yeah.
seen like that note that George
Yeah.
H.W. Bush and that the presidents used to do that all the time, leave little handwritten notes for their successor in the Resolute desk. And George H.W. Bush's was so high-minded and so moving in its devotion to the system rather than partisanship. And we're so far from that now.
Right, right. Well, now I feel like they raised the flag a little for optimism. Like I said, I'm very pessimistic in the short term, but optimistic more in the long term. And that is that I do also try to keep in mind the fact that we're about the same age that when we grew up, we were actually afraid of nuclear bombs were going to drop on our head literally any moment. So, there
Yes.
have been things about our political and geopolitical situation that have been scarier and worse than this.
Yeah.
So,
The day after.
yeah, all of that. Exactly. And that's what we grew up with. What was, I showed War Games to my kids. It's just
Yeah.
that Matthew Broderick movie and this idea that, the tremendous, I mean, it was just suffused popular culture, this tremendous immediate fear of nuclear war going to destroy the entire world.
Yes.
And you couldn't say it was hysterical. It was, it was a real thing that could have happened.
Yes.
So anyway, I just want to sort of put that as a context to keep some lid on the gloom and doom here.
Yes.
But I really want to thank you for talking to me about this and for noodling over these issues and trying to get to the bottom of them.
Well, thanks for having me. And yes, I certainly hope optimism is correct and I'm wrong in my pessimism. Not that my pessimism has that much specific to it, but yeah, I'm definitely inclined in that direction, and I hope I'm wrong.
I'm Rob Tracinski. My guest today has been Damon Linker, who teaches political science, the theory at least, and now increasingly the divergent practice at the University of Pennsylvania. For more ideas and analysis, go to symposium.substack.com, where you find articles and more podcasts like this. Please like and share this on YouTube or on your favorite podcasting platform. And before I go, I got to add one more thing right now, which is I have a new book out, Dictator from Day One, How Donald Trump is Overthrowing the Constitution and How to Fight Back. It's available on Amazon. Please go check that out. Hopefully buy the book and spread the word about it for these difficult times that we're entering. Thank you for listening.